Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm very aware that I have the session right before lunch, so it'll be a good test of my questions, whether the answers are interesting enough that you focus on this instead of the sandwich that's waiting for you out there. I'm Eric Geller. I'm a cybersecurity reporter at Politico. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much to IGF for having me. I want to introduce the panel very briefly, and I will start to my left. John Morris is the Principal for Internet Policy and Advocacy at the Internet Society. Yoda Soros, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Let me just check the order here. Mallory Nodell, Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and Darren Jones is the Assistant Director for Strategic Technology Policy at the FBI. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. I'm glad we're here talking about encryption. It's an incredibly important issue, one I've written a lot about, but it's also an issue that is very kind of episodic in terms of how much we talk about it, how much it's in the news. It comes up, of course, whenever there's a violent tragedy and a suspect's phone can't be accessed, the data can't be decrypted, but then it tends to fade away again, and there isn't that sustained attention. So I guess I'll start with this, and I'd like each of you to respond. How do you make progress on resolving an issue that can't seem to sustain focus and attention from policymakers in the way that so many other issues are constantly on the agenda? And anyone can start.
So I'll jump in, thanks. You know, I've actually been involved in the conversations both on the civil society side, but actually also within government. And I would say a couple things. One, it is very challenging to have it so episodic and so tied to kind of a recent event. But I actually would suggest that that within government, the conversations are really a little bit more ongoing than perhaps it seems outside of government. So certainly within the United States government, I was there for 8 years. It was a topic of fairly active conversation kind of continuously. So that's not to say that it's not in the public view. It's absolutely a much more episodic thing. But I also think that on the, I think technologists have been looking at these issues pretty continuously. So to some extent, it flares up a lot. But I think there's a lot of thought going on.
So I would echo some of what John said. It is very difficult to keep any issue these days in the public sphere at all times, but would also agree, I don't really view it as episodic, perhaps just given what we experience at NCMEC. It's a constant issue of discussion. I think many of my colleagues would feel the same way. It's an ever-present policy issue, and one that we also see confronted with day-to-day examples. Perhaps not, again, a high-level public example of a terrorism case or a mass shooting that often does elevate the issue of encryption up into that public sphere. But I think it's a responsibility for all of us as, being involved in policy and advocacy around these issues, knowing the importance, knowing the difficult balancing, knowing the gray area that, I hope we'll all get into discussing a little bit more today around these issues, to really continue to press it into the public sphere. Because, as we also know, every time there is a large public issue, news media attention rises, it quickly goes away after 2 or 3 weeks until the next issue. And this is simply too important and too pervasive an issue on all sides for us to let that happen. So I think as policymakers and policy advocates, we have that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely has it's captured the imagination of different audiences in different ways over time. Like my colleagues, I'm thinking about it a lot. I'm involved in the engineering aspect of it from an internet architecture perspective. It's really important and kind of ever present. But in the mass audience, the public sphere, I think that it's a good thing when it's not, because it just means things are working. It's meant to support, secure and make safe every aspect of our lives, and it's doing that more and more all the time. More and more apps, more and more services are using encryption, and that's the way we want it. I mean, I remember back in my early career when I was doing trainings for journalists, human rights defenders, feminist activists, that we had to sort of teach them painstakingly over like a 3 or 5 day workshop how to use end-to-end encrypted email, and it was really hard, and it was sort of a bit demoralizing because it was one by one by one. Now we're in a situation where it's ubiquitous and getting more ubiquitous, and so the fact that people don't have to think about whether or not they're safe online, I think is a good thing.
So I would say, I think more than anything in the last year or so, what has kind of lifted this up for discussion is some of the activity around the world and what we're seeing in the EU. From the FBI's perspective, from law enforcement's perspective, of course, we see this every day. And I've often described it as, look, this discussion will get resolved at some point. It is inevitable. It's just a matter of, as encryption keeps moving, which is a good thing. It's a fabulous thing. We love robust encryption. But as it continues to move and it's implemented in such a way that precludes lawful access, that pain point continues to rise. And so we're seeing more and more of that, or hearing more and more of that from our state and local colleagues. I think because, as they say, all politics is local, I think that will drive more of the discussion in the future as well. And we're getting more inquiries. Another thing that is positive, or is at least encouraging to me, is a lot of the times when we have the discussions, people will come back and say, oh, we didn't realize that. That's not what we thought you were saying. So look forward to the discussion.
So obviously encryption, as you said, it does play an incredibly important role in protecting people's data, and we've just seen with the Supreme Court ruling on Roe v. Wade that there are a lot of concerns right now about the protection of personal health data for people who are seeking abortions, may seek an abortion. Of course, this goes beyond law enforcement in certain states, using the legal process to obtain that data. It also gets into activists who perhaps want to expose people associated with the pro-choice movement, people who are seeking abortions, facilitating abortions, potentially exposing their identity, their location, harassing them. Just wondering if you think that that ruling is going to change the debate, heighten it. Are we going to see any new kind of permutations of this debate with this obviously incredibly emotional issue that is now being connected to digital privacy, digital safety in a way that perhaps was not as much on people's minds before?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that one. I think that's absolutely accurate. CDT is working a lot on this issue, and encryption plays a huge role now. I would say, though, that from my perspective, always having worked at a global level in my career, that there are lots of parts of the world where things like encryption or things like abortion aren't available, and where this has actually been part of the reason why we work so hard to make end-to-end encryption available. So it's not new, but it's very new here, and I think it's an important event to talk about because it also, as we've seen, the way that these stories are going in the news implicates women or people who can be pregnant a lot more when they're minorities or when they're intersectionally disadvantaged. So we're obviously hearing a lot of stories about teenagers and people who don't have the funds to travel from state to state, people who typically don't have access to healthcare. And then the way that you're bringing this up, Eric, is exactly right. It isn't just about court processes. It's also now making it so that your intimate partner, someone who might actually have access to your device or share a Wi-Fi network with you, could be the one who is looking to expose this data about you. And that's why the end-to-end part is really important. And that's also why, device agency and user agency in our software is really important. We can't just outsource this to a problem of the intermediary or the service provider or the company. It's a full stack issue.
Let me just jump in. I agree with what Mallory has just said, but kind of talk at a slightly broader level. I actually did start my job at the Internet Society just about 3 weeks ago. But before that, I was at the Brookings Institution focused on consumer privacy legislation. And so more broadly, I actually think that the abortion developments may be first a trigger of more attention to consumer privacy generally, and then encryption will obviously be kind of an issue that gets looked at in that context.
So let's dig into the debate a little bit here. Darren, I know the FBI's position is there are ways to design lawful access schemes that don't significantly undermine cybersecurity, that allow us to have both our personal digital security and our collective, perhaps physical security. I have, reported on this for a while. The overwhelming majority of cryptographers and cybersecurity experts say that is not true, at least not right now. They've tried. They know that they could make quite a bit of money if they were to design and sell something like this. They can't make it work, and certainly this debate has been going on for decades. We haven't seen a solution yet that experts say would actually be secure on balance. So let me kind of ask you, kind of put it bluntly, but what is your pitch here? Why should the public, people watching here at home, people who hear about this later, why should they trust the FBI on this rather than the sort of the independent expert community?
Great, and I beg your indulgence to this. I got to unpack this. It's going to take me just a minute. I'll try to move through it as quick as I can. Let me start by saying a couple of things that surprise people. Number one, the FBI is not now, or have we ever, asked for a backdoor. We don't want one. I also don't want direct access to data. We've never asked for direct access to data. But I'm assuming we all agree you still want the FBI chasing bad guys. You still want your FBI and your law enforcement trying to prevent bad things from happening, regardless of whatever it is. So when you think about this, when you peel it back, there's really only three ways to do this when you're talking about lawful access. All right? You can get it off the wire, grab it off of literally a copper wire or out of the air. TLS encryption does a fabulous job securing against that, and I think we all love that. The second way you can do it is you can get it, we refer to it in the old telephony world as at the switch or with the provider who is facilitating the communication, the platform, what have you. That's the way it's done generally under the CALIA standard, the Communication Assistance to Law Enforcement. Or the last way you can do it, the last option you have is to get it from the device. Okay, or C&E, you would say computer network exploitation, going after data on the device. If you have to do that, if that's your only option, then you're going after all of the data. You can't surgically go in. You're going after a device, and you're having direct access to that data. And then you have the whole argument in the background that says, look, if that's my only option, and I'm trying to keep terrorists or bad people from doing something really bad, and I have a way to get into that device, which is better? Should I hang on to that and use that to prevent the bad stuff from happening? Or, depending on what the vulnerability is, I've got a huge cybersecurity mission at the FBI. Part of me wants to call that company immediately and say, there's a hole, let's close this to better protect all Americans. So when I say lawful access, I see lawful access as privacy enhancing and cybersecurity enhancing. So I know that's a lot. Let me stop there. Other people will have opinions.
Yeah, I would love for anyone who wants to jump in there, feel free to do so. Yes, yeah.
Let me make one other comment. You asked the question about, okay, how would you do this? There's a paper out this morning from two UK colleagues, Crispin Robinson and Dr. Ian Levy. One's at GCHQ and the other is UK Cybersecurity. That paper has been designed to answer that question with some specificity. Basically what they do is they go on and they say, based on this type of harm that we see online, here's some technical examples, very technical, it made my head hurt when I first read it, of how you would do this. It is absolutely possible. That I am absolutely certain of.
Can I chime in a little bit on that? So from a slightly different perspective, I think from the FBI, which obviously does focus on lawful access and the investigatory issues, NCMEC's focus mostly around the encryption debate is on detection. NCMEC is, for those of you that aren't as familiar with us, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a private nonprofit, and we serve as the nation's clearinghouse on missing and exploited children issues. So our role really in these encryption conversations is really focused on our work to combat child sexual exploitation. We operate the cyber tip line, which is really just a receiving mechanism for reports of apparent child pornography from the public, but especially from electronic service providers that have a statutory obligation to report apparent child pornography to us. So as a point of reference, just to kind of frame why this issue is important also from the earliest point at detection. Last year, NCMEC received over 29 million cyber tip line reports. Those reports contained over 85 million files, as we call them. So those are individual videos, images of child sexual abuse, or chat that might be involved in an enticement, grooming, or sextortion incident involving a child. We estimate that if the world or all the companies became completely ED encrypted tomorrow, we would lose 70 to 80% of those reports. So 20 million reports would simply not exist. Just to state the obvious, that doesn't mean that the children in those 20 million reports would not be sexually abused. A curtain would just fall. There would be no ability by a company voluntarily to choose to detect it. And I'll say unless, because I think the unless is really important here, even though it's slightly off the encryption topic, which is unless we come up with alternative methods. And I think that is an area that, could be a whole separate panel, I'm sure, and there needs to be so much more attention focused on as we move more and more, as Darren and everyone has acknowledged, to an encrypted world, we've got to look at the alternative measures to detect, because I don't think anybody wants child safety online to go into a free fall because every internet platform becomes ED encrypted. We need to have the alternative measures in place.
You mentioned the encrypted world, and I do want to ask you about the international piece of this. We've seen several of the U.S.'s closest allies, including Australia and the U.K., adopt laws around lawful access to encryption. Why do you think the tech industry has been less successful at sort of fighting back against those laws overseas than they have here in the U.S., where the debate has also been going on for quite a long time? To what do you attribute the disparity there in what we're seeing?
You said Australia and what other country?
The UK, I was thinking of the Investigatory Powers Bill.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that, but I did read the paper that Darren brought up this week. I think that so there is a lot of pushback in Australia because from the companies in Australia who can't make tech that people trust, and so there has been. I think ISOC put out a really decent report about the effects that has had on the tech industry, and so I don't know that law has much longer to live, and we haven't seen a huge amount of copycat, which is impressive given that it's been around now for a few years. So I think that means it was very unsuccessful. But the global piece is really key because there are no shortage of countries trying to adopt similar things to what the UK, the US, Belgium, Germany are proposing. Nigeria has a law now that would ask for content moderation and takedowns no matter if it's encrypted or not. Bangladesh has a traceability law, meaning that platforms have to be able to tell law enforcement where a message came from. India also proposed something similar. Brazil is going to do another traceability law. So we have yeah, there's no shortage, actually. And that's one of the reasons why we do form a civil society coalition around global encryption, because I think this is the risk. This is what we've been saying all along, that if you're a democratic government, you should probably want some degree of transparency and accountability and to build trust. Unfortunately, that is not what we've seen with the Snowden disclosures in 2013 and government hacking and things like that have eroded that, even in democratic places, but that it will not at all prevent undemocratic places for asking for the very same thing. And because of hostage-taking laws and other things in countries, there's no way to say no when Egypt asks for the same considerations for what it requires, or China, or so on. And I know, John, you have thoughts on that too. So yeah, I think the global fabric is a little worrying, but also I don't think it's all that risky. It's just ubiquitous, and it's taking a lot of effort to follow all the different conversations.
Let me jump in on kind of both questions. On the international question, I would say one reason that we haven't in this country adopted laws similar to what Australia has adopted, is that I actually think that our policy conversation is a lot more mature than happened in Australia and that happens in some other countries, where we have certainly a good number of members of Congress who also share the concerns that civil society raises about encryption backdoors and the like. But let me also jump back to the, I have not read the full Ian Levy survey report that just came out today. It came out this morning. It's 80 pages long. On the subway, I didn't get through all 80 pages. But I did read the executive summary, which is 5 pages long, which shows you how meaty the document is. And I actually want to say 2 or 3 complimentary things about that document, even though I think I pretty strongly agree with its conclusions. One complimentary thing is that of the discussions of these issues, it is one of the most kind of honest documents I've seen acknowledging that this is incredibly, incredibly hard from a technological perspective. And frankly, not pointing any finger at Darren, but pointing fingers perhaps at Darren's senior bosses over the last, the heads of the FBI over the last 20 years have really, in public, strongly argued that this is easily done, it's easy to do. Gosh, all those smart people out in Silicon Valley, surely they can just figure out a way to do it. The Ian Levy paper really acknowledges that this is incredibly hard, and it's not at all clear. Another thing the Ian Levy paper really looks at and acknowledges that an important question is, which in the U.S. debate coming out of the public statements of FBI directors is not really on their mind, which is that if you impose a mandate, if you impose some sort of mandate, how easy is it for the people you're trying to catch to circumvent and avoid whatever you impose? And I think that is a critical question that needs to be part of any conversation. And then finally, I mean, that paper, again, based just on the 5-page executive summary, the solution, the primary solution that it proposes or advances is client-side screening, which is a narrower proposal than what I think Darren was suggesting, which with all respect to Darren, I would say is in fact kind of backdoor access to encrypted flows of communication. And so, I mean, I think that the Levy paper, which clearly I'm not going to agree with when I get through all 80 pages, I'm fairly sure, is at least a pretty honest effort to acknowledge the challenges here.
So I will take the opportunity to set the record straight. Well, I do believe it is absolutely possible. It is not trivial in any way, shape, or form. This is difficult. It is very, very difficult, but it is possible. What's happening today, though, the way I've often described it is, let's say I go to a judge, I'm doing an investigation, I go to a judge and I get an order. The judge signs the order, and I go to a company and I serve that order, and the lawyers look at it, they validate the order, they turn around and they get the data, they serve it back, and it's very specific, prescribed to what's in that warrant. They give that data back. And we go a couple of days in the investigation, we get more information, and they say, oh, you know what, here's another subject, we got to go back, we got to get another order, go to the judge and go back to the company. So we do that. And we get an order and we go back to the company a couple of days later, and this time the company says, no, I can't respond to that order because we've implemented technology, encryption, in such a way that it's made this warrant-proof. We're unable to respond. We have intentionally designed this in such a way that we can't do it. Okay, the order hasn't changed, the investigation hasn't changed, nothing else has changed, but the decision has been made in a boardroom somewhere, as opposed to elected officials. That's kind of the way I view it.
Can I just ask, when you say it hasn't been made by elected officials, elected officials have had decades to pass a law giving you what you want. They haven't done it. They're hearing from the business community. There was some limited public polling during the San Bernardino fight. They had plenty of opportunities. They had these crises moments that typically galvanize action when there's support for the action. So the policymakers didn't act.
What I would say is probably to answer your original question is why are these other countries not as influenced? Well, these are American-based companies. The other countries and the leadership in those countries are not as heavily influenced by companies not based in those countries. So I think it's a rather obvious answer to that question. These are U.S. companies. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to vilify these companies. These are great American companies. But, there is powerful influence there.
But Darren, I would push back to say, one, it is not that any of these companies, at least the big major players, have decided, oh, we want to thwart the FBI. It is that for broader reasons in terms of what their customers want and in terms of what kind of goals of cybersecurity and privacy dictate, they are providing what their customers want and what other companies will provide if they don't provide. Obviously, encryption technology is not rocket science. It's ubiquitously available on the internet. And so if American companies, which in fact do work closely with NCMEC and with U.S. law enforcement as much as they possibly can, if American companies if they don't adopt strong encryption which customers want, then oftentimes it'll be non-American companies that provide what the customers are looking for. And then I would also kind of just make the broader point that the fact that a judge has said the law enforcement has the legal authority to request this information has never in our country meant that law enforcement would always be able to get that information. There are lots of circumstances long before the internet when law enforcement had the authority to get something, but it simply wasn't available. And so, I mean, it's not a surprise that sometimes you're not going to be able to get everything that you have the authority to get.
Mallory, I know you've been wanting to jump in, so give you the opportunity there. A lot's been said.
A lot has been said. I'm trying to decide what points I want to make. I guess maybe we could go back to this idea that what's being proposed in this paper that came out today is easy or that it's doable, because I think that is really stretching the truth and facts in a way that I want to comment on. So what that paper does is it has a sort of subjective view of privacy, which is not uncommon. We all feel like privacy is important in different ways because we're different people, and that's a personal viewpoint. And maybe somebody who works for an intelligence agency would have a different one than end users. That's fine. But I think what really bothers me as an engineer is that there seems to be a really fluid definition of what end-to-end encryption is in that paper. And we've seen this for a long time. We've seen some of the same agencies go on the record with the media to say, it's fine, what we've proposed is perfectly compatible with end-to-end encryption, and that's the quote that lands in the media, and that is actually just not true. And so what we've tried to do, this is again why I'm sort of working on the back end, even when there's not media attention on the issue, is to try to get clarity from an engineering perspective. What is end-to-end encryption? How is it defined? And so we've done that in a few different ways. There's obviously a formal definition. There's what is the end-to-end principle, which is a sort of internet architecture networking principle. What's an end? That was a really interesting conversation. What's an end? Is it my device? Is it me? Is it the software that's running on it? That matters a lot when you talk about client-side scanning as a proposal. Then we looked at, not a formal definition, we went beyond that and looked at what are the features. So is, content moderation a feature of end-to-end encryption? I mean, probably not. But maybe some of the other things that are things like perfect forward secrecy, meaning that your key changes often enough that if you get access in one point in time, it doesn't give you access forever, similar to going back in time. Other kinds of features like that, that maybe not all end-to-end encrypted apps offer, but there's some threshold beyond which if you don't offer that, it's not really safe or reliable end-to-end encryption. And then the last way we tried to define it is, what do users expect? And I think that the narrative that, people have been communicating on a platform and then that platform goes behind encryption and then everything goes dark and people can't access it isn't really how the story has gone. It has been that people have downloaded apps that they think they're going to be secure on, have had secure and confidential conversations on those apps, and it would be really problematic to then turn these apps into essentially honeypots where people think that they're secure, but actually they're incredibly leaky, and they could have just been having the conversation in clear text on Facebook the whole time, right? Like, we as users have some expectations in real life that we can have a private conversation. You and I can walk down the street in Washington, D.C., and talk, and nobody probably would be able to hear us without a bit of effort. What we've learned in the pandemic and what we're learning now is that more and more and more of our lives are lived online, and it should not be that private conversation is impossible in the digital age. And that is the core point. And we shouldn't erode these ideas of, well, is it technically possible or is it easy or not? Because you are making a trade-off then when you make those technical design decisions. And it's not a matter of easy or hard. It's a matter of, is it encrypted or is it not encrypted?
Yeah, go ahead.
You raise an interesting point, and part of the reason I enjoyed the first panel so much is they talked about the First Amendment and what some of those things mean, and you are absolutely correct, and the devil's in the details when you're talking about definitions of what is end-to-end and what is not. But I guess what I would say is we've never been a country of absolutes. What has really changed in the last several years is technology has taken us to a point. For the first time in history, technology has taken us to a point where it is now possible, in fact, very doable, to use technology in such a way to prevent data, for whatever reason, from being accessed. And what I would suggest is, if you look back at the history of this country and you look at the Fourth Amendment is there because the Founding Fathers said originally, look, we recognize there are going to be times when the greater public good supersedes an individual's privacy or right to privacy. And so when we move into this new space, to kind of take that whole fundamental argument that I think comes along with the Fourth Amendment, I think that we start to get into some dangerous territory there. Let me stop there.
Yes, we unfortunately don't have time to completely litigate the definition of the Fourth Amendment in the context of encryption today. But actually, Darren, I did want to ask you, Yoda shared some data earlier. The FBI has had in the past produced data to Congress and the public about how many phones it can't access. And in 2018, it was revealed that those numbers were significantly inflated. They were incorrect. The FBI said it was going to do an audit, but it has never released accurate numbers. Can you talk about what's going on here? I've put this question to the press office many times. I have you on the stage. I can't resist asking you, why have we not seen corrected numbers about just how big this problem is from the FBI perspective?
So I'm not sure. I don't have a number to give you. I haven't looked at that in quite some time. But what I can tell you is that number would be extraordinarily fluid. And the FBI is a very small piece of that. I mean, everybody kind of looks at the FBI because we're the voice and we're saying, hey, this is a problem. But what I would suggest to you is we are a very small piece of that. There are 18,000 law enforcement agencies across this country. And every single time I talk to those agencies, they tell me how many of these things are sitting on the rack and working. And here's another, and this is a bit fundamental, I'll give you that, but what starts to happen when state and local law enforcement don't have the ability to deal with these devices is they naturally turn to the feds for help, or to the FBI, and they'll try to send them up to us. Okay, now you've got us trying to prioritize which cases should be worked. That's not good for anybody. That local cases should be decided at the local level and what gets investigated there. If it has to turn to the feds and our only option is C&E type work, now you've got the feds prioritizing. I don't think that's a good idea. That's probably not as satisfying as answer as you were looking for. But,
I'll follow up with the press office once again and see if we can get that data. John, I wanted to ask you, you led the policy office at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration for 6 years, including, I want to make sure I have the list right, this was during the mass shootings in Paris, San Bernardino, and of course Sutherland Springs, Texas, each of which reignited the encryption debate in the public, although as we've talked about, you folks have been working on it behind the scenes consistently. Can you talk about how that conversation inside the administration went, of course, multiple administrations, while you were a senior official at NTIA? Did it feel like Groundhog Day every time it came up in public again and agencies had to discuss it publicly, or did you actually see the nature of the conversation change over the years?
Sure. I mean, obviously I can't, well, first off, I don't think I've ever measured my time in government according to when mass shootings happened this first time. But,
unfortunately, kind of a grim number there, but yeah.
But, I kind of suggested earlier that I think there was kind of an ongoing conversation. So it wasn't within government a restart. It wasn't kind of a ground zero, kind of starting again when these things arose. And so to me, the conversation within government was, and I assume still is, a very, very serious attempt to find solutions. And I mean, you can't really go up to the White House as the Commerce Department and just say no to the Department of Justice and expect to prevail most of the time. You have to be looking for solutions. And so, I mean, certainly without going into any details that I shouldn't get into, there were serious cross-government technical efforts to kind of try to find potential solutions and models. And so, I mean, at the technical level, at the policy level, and really at the political level, I think that the conversation certainly continued from when I joined in early 2011 until literally I was in meetings at the White House the week I left government in mid-2019 about these issues. And so I'm not really giving you much concrete information, but with very rare exceptions, I have to say that the conversations did get down to kind of specifics. That they didn't always, in my mind, I will generally say that, law enforcement wasn't always willing to kind of be very clear within the conversations about what it really wanted. And so it was kind of pulling teeth to say, okay, well, do you want to be able to access every hard drive, for example, that is encrypted, an encrypted hard drive? Is that something that's in scope as to what law enforcement wants? And I'm sympathetic to Darren's posture because, and I'm not saying Darren, was forthcoming or not. We were in some meetings together, but I'm not attributing any of this to Darren. Where from a law enforcement perspective, they need in their law enforcement investigations to get access to whatever clues that they have. And so from a policy perspective, they don't want to say, no, we're never going to need access to what the data on an encrypted hard drive. But when you were in a conversation to say, okay, well, what legislation should Congress pass on that? You need to answer that kind of question. Is this just data in motion? Is it are we in fact going to be mandating the physical hardware? And all of those decisions have enormous constitutional implications, they have enormous policy implications from a privacy perspective, but also in my job at the Department of Commerce, they have enormous economic implications. I mean, if the United States government mandates that every hard drive has to be kind of breakable by law enforcement, well, American hard drive makers are going to have a lot less ability to sell their products overseas. And so, I mean, there are a lot of very hard implications about any of these proposals, and you really have to get down to very specifics about what you want proposed, and that didn't happen a lot.
Darren, go over to you for your perspective on that. I know you've been working on lawful access for a long time, so over the past, I don't know, 3 administrations, what have you seen change in this debate?
I think I think I mentioned it before, I think what I've seen change the most recently is the threshold, that pain threshold has come up to where it's not just the FBI now being affected, and it's not just the Bureau looking at these cases saying, hey, that's a problem for us. The state and local volume continues to rise, and I think that has probably got more attention, both inside and outside the administration. Let me ask this question, I guess, or kind of put it in this perspective. You have your phone, doesn't matter what flavor it is, and you pull it out, and there's 2 apps side by side. And if you click the one app, it takes you down the traditional text messaging. And I know some of that technology is changing, but under the traditional text messaging, and you send a note to your spouse. And that's encoded into 1s and 0s, it's encrypted, sent across the network, and they get the message. If I serve an order on that company who delivered that message, they'll respond under the Communications Assistant to the Law Enforcement Act. If you choose the app right beside it, which is an over-the-top app, the same message is encoded to the 1s and 0s. It's encrypted and sent out over the network and come back. If I serve an order on that company, they say, no, it's encrypted. We can't do that. That's vexing to us. Some of the evidence now, the world has changed. When you think about violent crime and a crime scene, I was talking to a chief the other day, and he said, you know, Darren, it used to be when you go to a homicide scene, some of the best evidence was that weapon or the shell casings or what have you. Now, some of the best evidence is a phone, if you can find a phone at the scene, and if you could get into that phone. And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So I think we just have to recognize that our whole worlds are changing, and this technology that we are dealing with in law enforcement as evidence is changing that perspective.
I just wanted to continue that narrative a bit about the telecommunications and the difference between the 2 apps, because now you can buy on the market, kind of expensive but not out of reach, IMSI catchers that will absolutely spoof a telco, decrypt that for you, and you can do that at a protest. You can do that in your neighborhood, and it's really not hard. I mean, I remember the story. I grew up in a really rural place in the Midwest, and there was there was only one phone provider, and there's only one guy who worked for that company in town. And it turns out after, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years, people realized that actually he'd been like tapping everybody's phones. He's just like kind of one of these weird, you know, characters from a small town. And I don't know, I bring that up because I feel like we treat these fail points as being out of reach. But more and more, just as we're talking about how this technology is changing, the technology to disrupt these technologies is catching up. And it's, in a lot of places, especially authoritarian regimes, pretty lucrative to make that kind of technology. And so it's not totally out of reach. And it isn't, unfortunately, just you guys. And that's the major risk.
Yoda, I want to just ask you a little bit about the more recent sort of phase of the encryption debate, which has moved away from terrorism, I think, at least in most of the discussions, and is more now about child sexual exploitation, child abuse, all these situations where the government maybe is able to get the victim's phone, potentially intercept some data between the victim and the suspect. They can't read it. They can't find this person. We've seen some legislation, it hasn't passed, but on other aspects of this debate about, you know, Facebook having this data and not sharing it. You know, there's been quite a big backlash to the tech industry in other areas that has spilled over to this conversation on the Hill. Do you think that this is going to be, the issue that you work on is kind of a more viable way to get some movement on lawful access than some of the other issues in the past? I mean, how do you see the public responding to the points that you've been making about, this is a really emotional issue. People with kids really want their kids to be safe and to be somebody who can be recovered by law enforcement if this happens to them. So is this going to sort of move things along, in your view, in a way that perhaps the sort of the counterterrorism discussion was not as effective in that regard?
It's definitely a good question. And, from our perspective at NCMEC, we're focusing only on the CSAM issues, the child sexual abuse material issue. And I just want to draw a little bit of a distinction, even though both are so relevant to the encryption issue, between lawful access, which is certainly Darren's territory in terms of what law enforcement might be doing and trying to get into a phone and get viable evidence, and the focus where NCMEC really is focused on, which is the detection, right? Which, of course, if there's no detection, there will be no concern about lawful access because there will be no report, there will be no indication of child sexual abuse material. I hope it doesn't, I hope the issue around CSAM doesn't become the issue necessarily that tips encryption simply because it's emotional. I think it needs to tip the issue because it's real and it's incredibly horrifying and the volume is just tremendous. And I know, just to tip off a little bit of something that John said earlier about, companies, I don't want to misquote what you said, but you were talking about companies, focusing on the commercial need or the business desire by their customers to have encryption. But, every business decision of that sort has an amazing human impact. And in this case, the decision to encrypt has an amazingly destructive quality for child safety online. So, I think it's also very difficult to talk about. It's not something I can show. It's not something I can bring examples of. Survivors of these crimes live often in incredible trauma after their recovery. They certainly do not want to discuss their experiences. Some families, parents often are willing to do that in some very kind of anonymous contexts. But I think that hampers the public discussion around this issue so much. But, I do think it's something we have to grapple with. It is a business decision. It is perhaps a desire, certainly, of customers and of end users. But they have to accept what comes with the delivery of that feature. And I think that's, again, I kind of referred to the gray area earlier. I know we all have our opinions. They're pretty well, I think, established around encryption. Is it easy? Is it hard? What does it mean exactly? Where should the line be? But I think we all need to accept that there is this gray area. We have to grapple with that. And I think that's maybe the hard phase of the debate, whether it's been 10 or 15 or 20 years that folks have been discussing this. We need to get into that space because there is real significant harm. Again, we would estimate 20 million reports of child sexual abuse a year simply would vanish. And I don't think anyone in this room or watching this video would feel like that's an acceptable outcome or an acceptable transfer of value here in getting whatever we define as a complete E2E encrypted environment. So I think that's where we have to go. We have to lay out what we would lose, and we have to lay out where we want the balance to be. There's no black and white here, I think. There's no black and white in any legal issue in the U.S., right? There's always a little bit of give and take. And I think where the dialogue has been previously, it's either encrypted or it's not. There's either child safety or it's not. We need to really move away from that because that is not really a helpful framework for this dialogue.
Well, since I said that, maybe I can elaborate what I meant. I sort of meant that from a technical perspective, things are one or the other. But I am highly invested in coming up with solutions to these problems. I might be on the side of, I would say that my position is solving these issues, strengthen encryption, and make it more ubiquitous. And that is why I think, CDT put out a report last year that talked about ways of doing content moderation in end-to-end encrypted systems. It actually does, I think, a more fair analysis than the Ian Levy paper that came out today, but essentially has the same goal, right? If we can, we're also doing this at the Internet Architecture Board for transport encryption, because a lot of network security folks don't want transport encryption intentionally intentionally on their network if they can help it, because it makes it harder to manage their network. But we're actively trying to solve that problem so that they adopt encryption. That's, I think, a good thing. And I think we want users that are on these apps that are end-to-end encrypted to feel like they're safe, to feel like they can do things like user reporting, that they're not going to get unsolicited images, that people aren't going to be able to contact them when they don't want. So we share a lot, actually. Even if we approach the problem from different places, I think we're all actually pretty involved in trying to come up with solutions, but with some boundaries. And I think, that's where the sort of details matter quite a bit in how it actually is achieved.
Can I just add, I definitely appreciate that. I did not mean to suggest that you were not invested. I'm familiar with the paper that you put out last year. And again, where the balance is struck is I think, the more relevant part of this discussion and dialogue going forward, because there really are balances. Everybody will, lose something and hopefully gain something in this kind of societal decision.
Let me jump in and say, first, I certainly have enormous respect and appreciation for the work of NCMEC, and I litigated a case that was about 20 years ago that was at the intersection of the First Amendment and child abuse material, and I'm very, very personally aware of kind of the horrible material out there. But from that litigation 20-odd years ago, one thing I noted is that, back on Usenet, which is kind of a bulletin board that old people in the room might know what it is, back then, there was this, horrifying but plainly easily available guide to pedophiles to be kind of how to avoid being caught, how to transmit your horrible images without being caught. So I'm confident that the similar guide is available today out there. I'm confident it is far more sophisticated than it was 20 years ago. And I would just kind of pose the question, which I can't answer, but pose the question as to, right now, these major American companies, which are trying to work with NCMEC in some areas, not doing everything that you would like, but trying to work with NCMEC pretty closely in some areas. These major American companies are, in many cases, adopting end-to-end encryption because that's what their customers want. And if the United States essentially outlaws that, there will still be products on the internet widely available that offer end-to-end encryption, and they will be operated by companies that are not trying to work with NCMEC or with the FBI on this issue. And so I really do, I can't answer this, I can't prove the point I'm making, but I really do think that it's an important question that your communities, both FBI and NCMEC, should ask as to what's the end game here and what will it look like. Now, from a law enforcement perspective, they're obviously not just focused on CSAM. They're looking much broader, and they have different challenges. But I do wonder, will the world that you envision be a better world for stopping child predators?
I certainly, appreciate that. It's a little theoretical, of course, and we do work with international companies as well. So, that's kind of an interesting mix. We're not working solely with U.S. companies because the world of the internet is global, of course. I think I might contest a little bit the scenario as a bit of a slippery slope, right? That we should sort of accept what it is because an alternative might be worse. So we shouldn't kind of rock the boat, so to speak. I'm not suggesting you're saying NCMEC is rocking the boat, but I don't think that is sufficient in the area of child safety. There are increasingly, as Darren referred to also, international laws that are looking at similar issues, whether it is content moderation, reporting detection, using certain technologies, perhaps encryption as well. So I think that will continue. Many of these countries, to Mallory's point as well, are much further along than the U.S. in terms of perhaps too quickly sometimes legislating around these issues. But countries have shown that they're quite willing to engage in that kind of legislation as well. So I don't think it's either the U.S. or kind of a wasteland, in terms of international companies. I would say a few things. I would say, again, that we have relationships with international companies. I have no doubt that if more international companies become more appealing to you as consumers in some way, that we wouldn't be able to, adopt precisely the same sorts of relationships. And I think, the issue here is the balance. So I think, again, I don't know if it's easy or hard to come up with solutions necessarily around the encryption issue and child safety or some form of detection, even if it's not content moderation based. But I think it's essential. So I think I proceed from that as kind of the truism here, that we can't simply, say that, the international companies might be more dangerous or more careless or more lackadaisical perhaps around this area. I think we have to look at the industry as a totality and accept that, companies everywhere also will have some of the similar concerns, and their citizens will as well. So if it is an international company, that maybe suddenly becomes very popular in the U.S. instead of Meta or Dropbox or Google or any of the other companies that people use, I think, again, that company will have the same concerns that U.S. companies will have. I think they will want to work to try to find a balance.
I do want to give Darren a chance to jump in, and then I want to see if we have any questions as well. So a few minutes for you, Darren.
I just want to make a quick comment that I don't think this is what customers are asking for. When we hear that comment all the time, this is what customers or consumers are demanding. Look, consumers want security. That's no surprise to anybody. That's what I want as a consumer. But I've never asked for absolutes. It's being marketed as this is better, and if you don't have this, then somehow it's just not good. What I would say is I choose my email provider because I know it's got great TLS encryption, so that's very, very secure. But I love the fact that it's being scanned, so if somebody tries to send me some garbage or malware, they're going to get that out. That's very valuable to me. And the other thing, I would take you again back to the cellular networks. Millions of those calls made around the country every hour. All of those are encrypted, all right, from the device to the tower, from the tower back through the core. But when a judge issues an order and says, here's judicial process that says you have the authority to get to that, those companies take that extremely well implemented, very robust encryption, and they can take that off to prepare that or make that available to law enforcement. Without exception, I've never had a single one of these companies tell me that it can't be done. Now, they do agree it's not trivial. And I have also heard repeatedly and consistently that until it's compelled, it won't happen.
I want to see if we have any questions. We could certainly go on for, I think, another 2 hours here. But if anybody wants to pose a question to any of the panelists, feel free. Yeah, please. I think we're going to wait for a mic here. Folks at home can hear the question as well as the answers.
Thank you, and another great panel, 2 in a row. So thank you and IGF and the people who put this together. My name is Rick Lane. The question, the sort of the panel description was beyond the encrypted content debate, and we ended up having a content encryption debate. But
That's on me a little bit there.
Yeah. So, but you start off at the point about Roe v. Wade and what happens, and there was an excellent answer on some of the concerns. But what was, to me, what really triggered my thoughts was when the young girl who was raped. What went through my mind working with NCMEC and other child safety groups was what happens if that was recorded on a phone and being transmitted. And the only evidence that the law enforcement had of that rape happening was a he said, she said, and then the evidence is on that phone. Should law enforcement have access to that video, and how do they gain access? So beyond the encrypted debate, what types of tools would law enforcement have to gain access to that video if that is as Darren just said, the only evidence instead of a gun or some other evidence that they have, is it worth it for the policymakers, not from the business side? I understand, I used to be the director of e-commerce and technology for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I understand the business arguments. But from a law enforcement and a public policy side, wouldn't public policymakers say, yes, that information should be accessed?
Sure, Rick, I'll bite. Absolutely, from a public policy perspective, policymakers are going to say, yes, that should be able to be accessed. But makers ought to also say, okay, if we mandate that, will that policy be effective, and what other unintended consequences will flow from that policy? And so I don't, for the least, at all debate or discuss or question the goal of catching child abusers. But it really does get into the devil into the details as to what exactly is the proposal. And I mean, the proposal, what has been adopted in Australia has, one, it's actually not been exercised very much there. And so we don't really know how bad is the security consequences from what they're doing. And also because it's it's only one country, I actually don't think we've seen a growth of, alternate technologies that are really off the grid, homegrown technologies or whatever to encrypt things. So, I think there are, as you know, it's all a very complicated question. But fundamentally, of course, catching child abusers should be a very important goal.
I can just chime in as well. I mean, of course, everyone's going to agree that that must be detected if it's being shared on social media or emailed around. And then certainly, from Darren's perspective, I know he would say that, of course, law enforcement should be able to get access even if it was just filmed and saved on a phone. I think the important thing, and I wish, again, like the dialogue kind of next moves here, because these panels are very interesting, but, we all have different perspectives. Everybody knows, again, kind of what they are. But I think each of us could probably come up with 20 very concrete examples, much like that one, more detailed, in terms of, again, a crime against a child, some other sort of crime, whether it's terrorism or otherwise, a serious, privacy concern, whether it's, internationally based or U.S. based, an activist, again, somebody with a serious, concern, again, around the privacy of their communications that might be very debilitating if that was not there. I feel like what we need to do is put those on the table and sort out not what are we going to give up necessarily, who are we going to sacrifice, because I hate pitting individuals who are survivors and victims against each other. And I feel like often this debate sort of goes towards, are children more important than privacy, and vice versa. And that's not productive. And that's not the world we live in, right? We don't pick one. We try to raise all boats kind of as high as we can in terms of those interests. But I think that's what we need to do. What is the solution? I don't know. Like John said, devil is definitely in the details, around this. But I think until we start actually looking at examples, this is a case, this is a scenario, this is an incident against a child, how would we deal with it from a technical standpoint? Are there alternatives that, again, may not be traditional content moderation as we view it? And I think there's a world of other options that, again, is not the topic of this panel, but I think are very worthy of discussion. So I really think that's where the dialogue needs to go, exactly those kind of examples.
So I'm not a criminal lawyer. I'm a technologist. This is a little bit outside my expertise, but I am a woman in this country, and I'm quite sure that rape cases are typically not prosecuted. There's a big dearth right there, and I've never heard that it's end-to-end encryption fault. Just putting that out there. I don't think that that's the issue. I also think that, to the point you just made, which is a really good one, that we shouldn't be pitting survivors against each other. You know, young girls and all children need end-to-end encryption too. And you also need end-to-end encryption when you rely on other people to do reporting, for example. So if you maybe have come across CSAM, or you've witnessed abuse, or you need to reach out to the authorities and tip them off, you're probably going to want to do that in a way that preserves your privacy and identity. Otherwise, you might not feel safe doing so. So there's lots of encryption already in use for things like online reporting hotlines and that sort of thing. When I once spoke to another person somewhere else in the world who worked on similar issues in their country with children who've been abused. They told me in 2016, when WhatsApp announced that they were going to roll out end-to-end encryption, that they were relieved because they felt that their teenagers that they talked to regularly would feel safer in coming out and talking about their stories with her. And so that, I think we need to embrace that. We need to lean into that. We need to remember that teenagers are highly private people, if you know them. I was a school teacher, and so in high school, and I know quite well, they would like to hide everything from adults if they could. They have a really keen sense of privacy, and I think we should not be sort of enforcing the idea that the only way you're going to stay safe is if someone is watching at all times, that you're not being sort of abused. And it's a thing that we want to be very careful about introducing as something that's just ubiquitous and sort of built into all the apps and online spaces.
So when I hear your question, and it brings me back to the first panel again, what I boil it down to, there's no perfect world here. Even today under CALIA, there's no perfect solution. That's not a 100% solution. There never will be. So it's not going to be elegant. It's not going to be perfect. And it's going to be very individualized with companies and apps and services. But when it all boils down at the end, the question I keep asking is, are we going to allow technology to dictate our national core values? Or are we instead going to allow our national core values to inform, as a country, as a citizenry, as a nation, how we implement and use technology and security for all Americans? That's kind of the way I see it in the end.
All right, well, by my watch, we have about 2 minutes left, so I will let you all go early. Thank you so much to my panel, and thank you everybody here for coming out and listening to the discussion. It's been great.